Hello everyone, thank you for the introduction. How's everyone doing today? Yeah! What an upgrade. Last year this is amazing. Thank you for the adopting team for inviting me back. It's a privilege to be here to talk. I'm really excited. It's been a pretty nice stop the last few weeks, especially apparently the price went up a little bit, so especially for that, it's been very exciting. But I have some news I'm thrilled to share in today's presentation regarding nation-state adoption and give a larger perspective on where we've been so far. So, unfortunately, for me, I feel like this slideshow is going to be out there in a matter of weeks, if not days. But without further ado, let's get to discussing ranking Bitcoin adoption and where we sit. So, 3 things I'm going to attempt to answer today's short, brief 20-minute presentation. Number 1, which nation-states as of today are ahead, as well as, like I just said, announce several new nation-states that are looking to adopt Bitcoin. Number 2,
where you rank, how much Bitcoin should you get? Obviously, this is a very brief window where individuals have the ability to front-run nation-states, and so that's a very common question. How much should I get in light of that anticipation? And then number 3, of course, discussing game theory and where we go from here. So first, who am I? My name is Luke Broyles. In case you don't know who I am, I make Bitcoin content, videos, articles, tweets, back when they were still called tweets, and lots of Bitcoin content. I work at Blockware. I do their podcast, and I'm thrilled to be a part of their team. We have mining operations in 4 different states, hosted mining, where we help people mine Bitcoin in an extremely user-friendly and cheap and affordable fashion. Of course, I also help people with one of the most important things in all of Bitcoin, which is self-custody and taking protection of that Bitcoin. So that's something I help people do. I help people take self-custody, get off exchanges, set up retirement accounts, trusts, family vaults, all kinds of things for their Bitcoin. So I am by no means an expert. I have been very grateful and fortunate to wonderful event organizers, just like Adopting Bitcoin here, to have traveled to 10 different countries over the course of this year alone. And I think that things are only going to accelerate from here. So that's who I am. Who I am not is I am not a blind shill or promoter or person that is supporting the politicians, right? Obviously, we have our criticisms of politicians. We want to applaud them and approve them when they do wonderful things, good things, and condemn them when they do evil things. So I want to make that very clear. When I was interviewed back at the Bitcoin conference by CNN, they repeatedly tried to get me to come out and say, you know, pro-politician things, but I want to make it very clear why this presentation I think is important. It's not because Bitcoin needs the politicians. It's not because the politicians only do good things, but it's because we want the politicians. We want the nation states. We want the mega adopters of Bitcoin. We want these individuals and institutions to understand that the end of political currency is not the end of the world, right? Most people and most politicians, when you tell them Bitcoin destroys fiat, Bitcoin demonetizes fiat, most of them hear that as a threat and something that's offensive to them, right? And it's really important, in my opinion, that we focus on these nation states and adoption, because this is ultimately the most important thing we can do to make sure that this is a transition, not a revolution. So let's talk about first, how much does one need to get? Where are we? Everyone says, oh, Bitcoin is digital Manhattan. Bitcoin is digital cyberspace. Bitcoin is, you know, like New York City, right? It's like Manhattan in 1776 or 1850 or whatever. And the point I really want to emphasize here is that we are not in 1776 digital Manhattan. We're not even in 1700 digital Manhattan. We are significantly earlier than I think is accustomed for us to remember within our little bubble or echo chamber here, right? So if we're going to assume that there are 10 million people on the planet today that are adopting Bitcoin, right? Keep in mind, there are only 4 million on-chain addresses with more than 1/10 of a Bitcoin. And most Bitcoiners on chain have way more than one address, right? So the point is 10 million adopters. This includes people with on-chain Bitcoin. This includes shareholders of MicroStrategy. This includes people with, you know, non-trivial amounts on exchanges, right? Even if it's just a couple $100. In my opinion, 10 million is the right order of magnitude, right? I don't think it's a lot more. In fact, I think maybe even that is really optimistic. But the point is, even if we assume there are 10 million Bitcoin adopters or users in the world today, that is still 12.5% of 1%. And so if we have the metaphor of Bitcoin is digital Manhattan, the appropriate year, the appropriate decade to compare Bitcoin at is not in the 1700s, but it's in the 1600s, specifically around the 1630s, depending on which census you use at the time. So to emphasize how early that is, that how early that is to New York City is that it's still called New Amsterdam. It's predominantly Dutch, not British, right? The first hotel to be built in what is now New York City is 7 years away. We're 30 years under this era before we go to the British. And then the first revolution, eventually getting us to 1776, is still over a century away, right? So my big encouragement here is that you are not too late to Bitcoin, and we're not so far that it's too late. In fact, it's actually probably the opposite. If anything, we are too early to Bitcoin, and we've been waiting around for the nation states to start adopting Bitcoin, which I believe they are doing. So how many Satoshis per person as a benchmark to compare for the rest of the presentation? There are roughly 250,000 Satoshis per person on average. But as we all know, averages are highly skewed to the upside. And so a much more realistic median is around 50,000 Satoshis, if not less than 50,000 Satoshis. So let's talk about the little Bitcoin country everybody forgets, Bhutan. Congratulations to Bhutan. Bhutan, as many people in the room probably know, Bhutan was mining Bitcoin for years before becoming public with their mining. Bhutan is a very, very tiny country. Their GDP is $2.8 billion. They have less than 1 million people living in the country. Their total percentage of global GDP is tiny and minuscule, right? However, they've stacked a very good amount of Bitcoin relative to their economy and their population. Their stacking goal, if you assume Bitcoin is evenly distributed across the entire planet, their stacking goal was 546 Bitcoin. They have surpassed that goal by over an order of magnitude. So congratulations to Bhutan. Their Satoshis per citizen are coming up close to 2 million Satoshis per citizen on average in the country. Of course, we have everyone's favorite Bitcoin country, right? The first Bitcoin country. Woo, right? So El Salvador, as we all know, is a larger country than Bhutan. El Salvador's GDP is over 10 times larger, at roughly $30 billion. Still, again, representing barely 3% of 1% of the global GDP. El Salvador's target, if they want to have their share in Bitcoin, is 6,300 Bitcoin. Just like Bhutan, congratulations are in order to El Salvador for surpassing this goal with a very wide margin. The El Salvadorian government has acquired over 5,700 Bitcoin with Bitcoin individuals and companies that are coming to El Salvador. I think it is very, very conservative to say there are tens of thousands of Bitcoin indirectly coming into this country, from people moving here, from people owning here, from expats coming back to El Salvador now that it's much safer, right? So a variety of reasons, right? It's not only the Bitcoin factor, but for whatever reason, El Salvador has some very comfortable margin for having a significant number of Bitcoin per their citizen, right? And again, this is the averages, right? So the United States, where I'm from, we're a little bit more behind. I still think that we're in a pretty decent position. Obviously, our GDP crushes everyone else in the world at $25 trillion, about a quarter of the world's gross domestic product. Our stacking target, if we want to retain that position, is 5.3 million Bitcoin. And we're actually not too far off from that. The United States government, at the time of this presentation, has over 200,000 Bitcoin, as well as Bitcoin individuals is probably multiple millions worth of Bitcoin as a result of many Bitcoin adopters and OGs being in the country. Of course, the ETFs, which was a big piece of news in America. There were a lot of ETF holders and owners of those ETFs. And of course, private companies as well have probably stacked, somewhere in the low to mid six-figure number of Bitcoins, right? So as far as our stacking goal, if you take these assumptions, we're not there yet, but we're trying to get there. And obviously, I'm going to touch on Trump's election and his supposed interest in having America stack 1 million Bitcoin as a strategic reserve. So I'll get to that more in a second. But already as it is, America maybe is behind, but not quite as far behind as some other countries, right? So let's take the UK as another example. The UK has a few Bitcoin of their own, right? Unlike Germany, they didn't sell theirs, so good to the UK. The UK has 61,000 Bitcoin with their government. With individuals, obviously, they have less people than the United States and a lower GDP per person for the individuals, so it's somewhere in the mid six figures number of Bitcoin is the best estimation I can come up with, and of course, they have a few Bitcoin companies as well. However, they're nowhere near as prevalent as in the United States. So, again, they're still not at zero, but they've got a long way to go if they want to keep up with where they should be with their stacking goal, let alone getting ahead, right? So their Satoshis per citizen, on average, again, 700,000 sats. So in the UK, actually, the number of Satoshis per person aggregated out between individuals, companies, and the nation are lower than that of El Salvador. Whoops, I went one too far. Okay, China. China is, in my opinion, the one major global power that is significantly behind. Whoops, let me go back here. I'm having trouble with my clicker. There we go. So, like I just said, China, in my opinion, is the large economic player in the world that is significantly far behind. Obviously, as many of us know, and most of us remember, back in 2021, China banned Bitcoin mining. Of course, that failed because China banned Bitcoin mining 4 or 5 times. I lost count. And every single time it's failed, a significant portion of hash rate is still in China. And so despite that, the Chinese government, they own roughly 194,000 Bitcoin. Again, if we assume that there are millions of Bitcoin between the individuals, high net worth people in China, as well as a few Bitcoin, companies, maybe underground or private, even with those assumptions, and I think those are very optimistic assumptions, even with those assumptions, they are significantly behind where they should be. So, current global ranking, Bhutan, United States, and El Salvador are way far ahead of the rest of the world. And if we have not just as a ranking of number of Satoshis, but on a relative basis, where are these countries ranking? The United States and El Salvador and Bhutan, again, are in a very much better position than the rest of the world. Of course, Bhutan being far and away the biggest change between current GDP and where their current stack is, closely followed by El Salvador, and of course the rest of the world has a long way to go. Now looking forward from here, where do we go? In the United States, our main benefit is we have the money printer, we have the Lindy effect, we have the dominance, right? We have the ability to print more political currency for Bitcoin. El Salvador, what you all have here, you have the reputation. You are the branding company. You can only be the first once. It's a zero-sum game. And El Salvador here won that game. So that's never going to be able to be taken away from El Salvador, and I think that's very optimistic. Now, as we all know, Donald Trump was recently elected again as President of the United States. His goal, likely in the medium term, is for the United States to stockpile a strategic reserve of 1 million Bitcoin. Of course, other people, like most notably Kennedy and his cabinet, are wanting that number to be more like 4 million. And so even with those audacious goals, even with that ambition, still, it would be very difficult. Whoops. My clicker here is giving me trouble. Even with that audacious goal, it would be very difficult for them to supersede the number of Satoshis per person more than what other countries, including Bhutan and El Salvador, have done. So, game theory, and I want to have my little bit of announcements here, right? So as we said, Bitcoin has gone up a little bit since this event last year, which has been nice. Obviously, there's many reasons for that, right? The ETF was a major reason. More adopters is a major reason. Microsoft apparently considering buying Bitcoin. There are lots of reasons. But if we want to look at the future and ask where are we going from here, I'm thrilled to share an announcement made by a friend of mine at Satoshi Action Fund about multiple states and multiple countries now in the works on strategic reserves for their entities. Yesterday morning, Pennsylvania announced they're going to pursue a strategic reserve for the state of Pennsylvania. As we all know, and I just mentioned before, Donald Trump is looking for the United States federal government to have a stack of 1 million Bitcoin. Additionally, not 1, not 2, not 5, 10 total states in the United States of America also right now are working on strategic Bitcoin reserve policy. I've had that confirmed to me by the Satoshi Action Fund. 10 of the US states. In addition to 10 US states are 4 countries. 4 countries right now are working on legislation to begin getting off zero at the strategic level. Obviously, Michigan and Wisconsin had their pension funds begin allocating into Bitcoin. So there's a lot of influence coming. There's a lot of stacking coming at the sovereign level. So a lot of people have been speculating, oh, with all this price action, who's buying, right? Is it someone in the Middle East? Is it someone with a lot of oil? Putin said he might want to consider pricing oil and Bitcoin. Maybe it's Putin, right? There's a lot of speculation, but the thing we do know is that if we were to price all the Bitcoin in the world with oil, right? If we were to have Bitcoin be the unit of account with just oil, forget real estate, forget fine art, forget stocks, forget bonds, forget all fiat money, forget every other commodity or security on the planet, just oil is 1,272 Satoshis for every barrel of oil. And that means, again, forgetting every other asset in the world, If you own 1 Bitcoin, you effectively own the oil equivalent of 78,616 barrels. If you got 10 Bitcoin, congrats, you have 780,000 barrels of oil. If you have a tenth of a Bitcoin, congrats, you got 7,800 barrels of oil, right? My point is, if this game theory accelerates, if these 4 nations in the next 12 months do come out and publicly acknowledge their strategic reserves, I think that we can begin to start talking about this idea of pricing oil in terms of Bitcoin, just like Putin himself described. And so my point is, it might feel like it's too late for Bitcoin because the number has gone up a lot, right? I mean, it's up, what, 20, 30% the last few days alone, right? Like, it might feel like it's too late. But just like I said at the beginning of the talk regarding Manhattan, it's actually the inverse. If anything, you're too early. If anything, you are going to be remembered as this crazy, crazy person that was somehow in Bitcoin before we started pricing it oil. Can you imagine how much purchasing power they have, right? So my encouragement is stop looking at Bitcoin in terms of random numbers, a random price, or a random number of Satoshis. Think about that reality that the average person will probably have less than 50,000 Satoshis if Bitcoin becomes a global medium of account, not medium of account, unit of account, medium of exchange. And think of it in terms of barrels of oil, right? Think of your Bitcoin stack, and whenever you feel like I'm too late, I don't have enough, it's not worth a lot, think of it in terms of barrels of oil. How many barrels of oil do you own? So, like I said, it feels like it's too late because there's lots of people in here in Bitcoin that have been around longer than you, that have bought more Bitcoin than you, that have read more Bitcoin books and listened to more Bitcoin podcasts than you, all that stuff, right? So it might feel like you're too late, but my encouragement is right now, we disproportionately have a lot of whole coiner friends, multi-whole coiner friends, right? Disproportionately, again, we're in 1630s Manhattan. Like, everyone we know is super, super early to Bitcoin. And so therefore, we're biased to think we're too late. Where actually it's the opposite. Man, this clicker. Actually, it's the opposite. So on the screen here is a visual graphic of all the people in the world. That little guy at the top left, a fraction of that guy, 1 in 1,000, is all the whole coiners, and a fraction of that fraction is all the multi-whole coiners. So I only got 1 Bitcoin, you're not too late. I only got 5 Bitcoin, you're not too late, right? This is my point. We're on the eve of nation-state adoption, right? We have less in common with the near future than the ancient past, right? For the entirety of Bitcoin's history, we've gone from 0 to 1, maybe 2 if you argue Bhutan, nation-state adopters, okay? Very soon, we can have half a dozen within a year. What happens the year after that? What happens the year after that, right? So again, don't compare yourself as to quote unquote how early I am to Bitcoin based on your peer group today and all of our friends in this room. Compare it to the graphic on the screen here. In addition, just something that's also even crazier, UTXOs, right? Most people, assuming nothing changes with Bitcoin's base layer, most people will never make an on-chain Bitcoin transaction. Most people will not be early enough to Bitcoin to have the privilege and responsibility to own their own UTXOs. So that little purple range, right, give or take maybe a tiny little fraction, the majority of people will never be able to say, I was early enough to Bitcoin that I made a layer transaction once. Whoa, right? So my point is, that is how early you are to Bitcoin. One more example to hammer this home is that a lot of people look at Michael Saylor and they say, wow, Michael Saylor is so lucky, he was so rich, oh my goodness, he has so much money. My point is that if the median person, when this tiny uninhabited island right now of Manhattan becomes the, megatropolis like it is now of New York City, the point is that it's the same order of magnitude between someone with 5 Bitcoin, Michael Saylor, and that person, and the median person in the future, right? It's a multiple of 10,000. If you have 5 Bitcoin, it's a multiple of 10,000 between you and Michael Saylor. And likewise, you're so early, you are your own little Michael Saylor. You have your own little empire that is your couple Bitcoin, right? Obviously, if you have half a Bitcoin, you're 1 order of magnitude down. If you have 50 Bitcoin, you're 1 order of magnitude up. But my point in all of this, my big takeaway, if you take nothing else from this presentation, is just to keep this in mind. Nation-state adoption. Right now, the ranking is, in my opinion, Bhutan, El Salvador, and the United States by far have the largest advantage. Like I said, the United States has 10 states that are now considering this, as well as a Bitcoin-friendly president. El Salvador and Bhutan, of course, have already taken that leap of faith. That's, I think, the first conclusion to take. The second conclusion, even if the United States reaches those stacking goals, and I have suspicions they'll reach those stacking goals. Even if the United States gets those goals, congratulations to El Salvador. You have proven yourself, you've vindicated yourself, and it's going to be very hard for anyone to keep up with you on a per capita basis. However, countries, the biggest countries, have the most to lose, and so I think they're going to catch on really quickly. Like I mentioned before, we have 4 nation states in addition to the United States that are now considering, with Satoshi Action Fund, adopting a Bitcoin treasury strategy, right? And of course, finally, most importantly, the biggest takeaway in all this, in my opinion, is that you don't get to be in the top 0.01% of Bitcoin holders without accepting that top 0.01% of the risks, right? So I greatly appreciate your time. My big urgency is, I don't care if you use me or anyone else, my big encouragement is get off zero, get some Bitcoin, secure that Bitcoin in self-custody, consider your tax questions, consider everything with your legal questions, right? Take action now. Act like every single Bitcoin you own is already worth 80,000 barrels of oil, because that's the significance of what you have, and that is why it's really important you take care of these things now before the nation states actually execute these plans. So thank you. You can contact me on the screen there, take a picture of it, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you for having me back. Beautiful country here. Thank you.